The Supreme Court just finished the argumentation on the Colorado ballot access question. So as you might know, the Supreme Court of Colorado barred Donald Trump from access to the ballot, and that began a firestorm across the nation of other states considering it or possibly doing it. And of course, Trump is not a fan of that. And then you had red states saying, yeah, well, if you're gonna ban him for insurrection, then we're gonna ban Biden for something. You see him drinking boba, that was weird. We're gonna take him off the ballot for that. So the Supreme Court had to weigh in, and now we have the arguments. Just one day of arguments, and we expect their judgment to come out soon. So definitely stay tuned for that. Look, it was a complex question covering a century and a half of law, of cases. We can't dive into all of the nuances of it, but I do want to highlight a few of, I think, the individually spiciest and most interesting moments, even if they weren't intended to be the most interesting moments. And the first has to do with Justice Jackson having a somewhat contentious back and forth with the Trump lawyer, as you'll see in this video.
Question. The Colorado Supreme Court concluded that the violent attempts of the petitioner's supporters in this case to halt the count on January 6th qualified as an insurrection as defined by Section 3, and I read your opening brief to accept that those events counted as an insurrection, but then your reply seemed to suggest that they were not. So what is your position as to that?
We never accepted or conceded in our opening brief that this was an insurrection. What we said in our opening brief was President Trump did not engage in any act that can plausibly be characterized as insurrection.
All right, so why would this not be an insurrection? What is your argument that it's not? Your reply brief says that it wasn't because I think you say it did not involve an organized attempt to overthrow the government. So
that's one of many reasons, but for an insurrection, there needs to be an organized, concerted effort to overthrow the government of the United States through violence. And this
so the point is that a chaotic effort to overthrow the government is not an insurrection?
No, we didn't concede that it's an effort to overthrow the government either, Justice Jackson, right? None of these criteria were met. This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection as that term is used in Section 3.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Counsel.
So that was fascinating. That was also, perhaps more importantly, on the question of whether it was an insurrection for quite a while. It briefly came up again, and we'll talk about that. But I think this is sort of core to the whole thing, not just to this particular case and the weird semantics that they're gonna get into throughout every aspect of this, whether he engaged or not in the insurrection, whether it was an insurrection, also even applies in that semantic way. But his attempt to be like, it was just a riot, or it wasn't organized, so it doesn't count. And she pushed back against that. And look, spoiler alert, I think largely most of the justices seem to be very hesitant to uphold what Colorado did. But this is an area where there was fighting back from at least Justice Jackson. So it has to be concerted, it has to be organized, it has to be an attempt to overthrow the election. How is this not those things? Now, the riot itself was not organized. If you just look at a picture of it, it's chaotic. But the fact that it was there was literally organized. They were directed to go there. They were told to come, they were told to gather, they were then told where they should go next and what they should do when they get there. If they're chaotic when it happens, the hell does that matter? That's like saying if Trump had had tanks like rolling down the boulevard firing shells at the White House, but then the fires that those shells set were chaotic, that wouldn't count. It was concerted. They'd been working for months in a variety of different ways to overturn the results of the election. This one component was seemingly in action, not organized. It went absolutely insane. But their efforts to organize alternate slates of electors, to influence state secretaries of state in the various states, all of that to stop the certification of the vote, was that not organized? Was that not literally directed by the man that it would benefit? And I understand that they're not there singularly to determine, to finally rule whether this was participation in an insurrection. But I think that sort of goes to the heart of people's concerns about all of this. And notably, where we cut that video off was basically the end of that conversation. The subject was changed. And later on in today's arguments, when the subject of whether this was an insurrection, whether Trump participated in it came up again, the subject was almost instantaneously changed again, in both cases by conservative justices who appear to have no interest whatsoever in there being a frank, clear, transparent discussion about what actually happened on January 6th, what it was, and Donald Trump's participation in it. And it doesn't mean that we won't get that conversation in the Supreme Court. This is about whether he can be on the ballot, whether in the end he's able to hold office, particularly if he is found guilty of some of these crimes, including possibly participation in an insurrection. They're almost certainly gonna have to return to the topic so they can evade it as long as possible. But this seems like damage control, maybe for them, but definitely for Donald Trump in the meantime. And if you're gonna have all of this argumentation come down to definitions, if it's gonna be so fundamentally semantic, then let's engage in some semantics. If it wasn't an insurrection, what the hell would be? What would have had to have happened on January 6th or in the weeks before January 6th for it to qualify as an insurrection? And for all of Donald Trump's participation in it, what more would he have to do to have engaged? Does he literally have to kick down the door to Nancy Pelosi's office himself? First of all, he's not capable, so how is he gonna do that? But no, the idea that he has to be on the front lines is ridiculous. He sent the front lines and all of the other lines too. I suppose that'll be adjudicated in other courtrooms, but there's a lot of cowardice, I think, by the justices on display today. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/thedamagereport. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.